Chapter 24 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 24 Gladstone and Morley. Mr. Gladstone paid my American four-in-hand in Britain quite a compliment when Mrs. Carnegie and I were his guests at Hawarden in April, 1892. He suggested one day that I should spend the morning with him in his new library while he arranged his books, which no one except himself was ever allowed to touch, and we could converse. In prowling about the shelves I found a unique volume and called out to my host, then on top of a library ladder far from me handling heavy volumes: "Mr. Gladstone, I find here a book, Dunfermline Worthies, by a friend of my father's. I knew some of the Worthies when a child." "Yes," he replied, "and if you will pass your hand 3 or 4 books to the left, I think you will find another book by a Dunfermline man." I did so, and saw my book, An American Four-in-Hand in Britain. Ere I had done so, however, I heard that organ voice orating in full swing from the top of the ladder: "What Mecca is to the Mohammedan, Benares to the Hindu, Jerusalem to the Christian, all that Dunfermline is to me." My ears heard the voice some moments before my brain realized that these were my own words, called forth by the first glimpse caught of Dunfermline as we approached it from the south. "How on earth did you come to get this book?" I asked. "I had not the honor of knowing you when it was written, and could not have sent you a copy." "No," he replied, "I had not then the pleasure of your acquaintance, but some one, I think Rosebery, told me of the book, and I sent for it, and read it with delight. That tribute to Dunfermline struck me as so extraordinary it lingered with me. I could never forget it." This incident occurred 8 years after The American Four-in-Hand was written, and adds another to the many proofs of Mr. Gladstone's wonderful memory. Perhaps as a vain author I may be pardoned for confessing my grateful appreciation of his no less wonderful judgment. The politician who figures publicly as reader of the Lesson on Sundays is apt to be regarded suspiciously. I confess that until I had known Mr. Gladstone well, I had found the thought arising now and then that the wary old gentleman might feel at least that these appearances cost him no votes. But all this vanished as I learned his true character. He was devout and sincere if ever man was. Yes, even when he records in his diary, referred to by Morley in his Life of Gladstone, that, while addressing the House of Commons on the budget for several hours, with great acceptance, he was conscious of being sustained by the divine power above. Try as one may, who can deny that to one of such abounding faith this belief in the support of the unknown power must really have proved a sustaining influence? Although it may shock others to think that any mortal being could be so bold as to imagine that the Creator of the universe would concern himself about Mr. Gladstone's budget, prepared for a little speck of this little speck of earth, it seems almost sacrilegious. Yet to Mr. Gladstone we know it was the reverse. A religious belief such as his had no doubt often enabled men to accomplish wonders as direct agents of God and doing his work. On the night of the Queen's Jubilee in June, 1887, Mr. Blaine and I were to dine at Lord Wolverton's in Piccadilly, to meet Mr. and Mrs. Gladstone. Mr. Blaine's first introduction to him. We started in a cab from the Metropole Hotel in good time, but the crowds were so dense that the cab had to be abandoned in the middle of St. James Street. Reaching the pavement, Mr. Blaine's following, I found a policeman and explained to him who my companion was, where we were going, and asked him if he could not undertake to get us there. He did so, pushing his way through the masses with all the authority of his office, and we followed. But it was 9 o'clock before we reached Lord Wolverton's. We separated after 11. Mr. Gladstone explained that he and Mrs. Gladstone had been able to reach the house by coming through Hyde Park and around the back way. They expected to get back to their residence, then in Carlton Terrace, in the same way. Mr. Blaine and I thought we should enjoy the streets and take our chances of getting back to the hotel by pushing through the crowds. We were doing this successfully and were moving slowly with the current past the Reform Club when I heard a word or two spoken by a voice close to the building on my right. I said to Mr. Blaine, "That is Mr. Gladstone's voice." He said, "It is impossible. We have just left him returning to his residence." "I don't care. I recognize voices better than faces, and I am sure that is Gladstone's." Finally I prevailed upon him to return a few steps. We got close to the side of the house and moved back. I came to a muffled figure and whispered, "What does gravity out of its bed at midnight?" Mr. Gladstone was discovered. I told him I recognized his voice whispering to his companion. "And so," I said, "the real ruler comes out to see the illuminations prepared for the nominal ruler." He replied, "Young man, I think it is time you were in bed." We remained a few minutes with him, he being careful not to remove from his head and face the cloak that covered them. It was then past midnight, and he was 80, but boylike, after he got Mrs. Gladstone safely home, he had determined to see the show. The conversation at the dinner between Mr. Gladstone and Mr. Blaine turned upon the differences in parliamentary procedure between Britain and America. During the evening Mr. Gladstone cross-examined Mr. Blaine very thoroughly upon the mode of procedure of the House of Representatives of which Mr. Blaine had been the Speaker. I saw the previous question, and summary rules with us for restricting needless debate made a deep impression upon Mr. Gladstone. At intervals the conversation took a wider range. Mr. Gladstone was interested in more subjects than perhaps any other man in Britain. When I was last with him in Scotland at Mr. Armistead's, his mind was as clear and vigorous as ever, his interest in affairs equally strong. The topic which then interested him most, and about which he plied me with questions, was the tall steel buildings in our country, of which he had been reading. What puzzled him was how it could be that the masonry of a fifth floor or sixth story was often finished before the third or fourth. This I explained, much to his satisfaction. In getting to the bottom of things he was indefatigable. Mr. Morley, although a lord, he still remains as an author plain John Morley. Became one of our British friends quite early as editor of the Fortnightly Review, which published my first contribution to a British periodical. The friendship has widened and deepened in our old age, until we mutually confess we are very close friends to each other. We usually exchange short notes, sometimes long ones, on Sunday afternoons as the spirit moves us. We are not alike, far from it. We are drawn together because opposites are mutually beneficial to each other. I am optimistic, all my ducks being swans. He is pessimistic, looking out soberly, even darkly, upon the real dangers ahead, and sometimes imagining vain things. He is inclined to see an officer in every bush. The world seems bright to me, and earth is often a real heaven, so happy I am and so thankful to the kind fates. Morley is seldom if ever wild about anything. His judgment is always deliberate, and his eyes are ever seeing the spots on the sun. I told him the story of the pessimist whom nothing ever pleased, and the optimist whom nothing ever displeased, being congratulated by the angels upon their having obtained entrance to heaven. The pessimist replied, "Yes, very good place, but somehow or other this halo don't fit my head exactly." The optimist retorted by telling the story of a man being carried down to purgatory and the devil laying his victim up against a bank while he got a drink at a spring, temperature very high. An old friend accosted him. "Well, Jim, how's this? No remedy possible. You're a gone coon sure." The reply came, "Hush! It might be worse." "How's that, when you are being carried down to the bottomless pit?" "Hush!" pointing to his satanic majesty. "He might take a notion to make me carry him." Morley, like myself, was very fond of music, and revelled in the morning hour during which the organ was being played at Skibo. He was attracted by the oratorios, as also Arthur Balfour. I remember they got tickets together for an oratorio at the Crystal Palace. Both are sane but philosophic, and not very far apart as philosophers, I understand. But some recent productions of Balfour send him far afield speculatively, a field which Morley never attempts. He keeps his foot on the firm ground and only treads where the way is cleared. No danger of his being "lost in the woods" while searching for the path. Morley's most astonishing announcement of recent days was in his address to the editors of the World, assembled in London. He informed them, in effect, that a few lines from Burns had done more to form and maintain the present improved political and social conditions of the people than all the millions of editorials ever written. This followed a remark that there were now and then a few written or spoken words which were in themselves events. They accomplished what they described. Tom Paine's Rights of Man was mentioned as such. Upon his arrival at Skibo after his address we talked it over. I referred to his tribute to Burns and his 6 lines, and he replied that he didn't need to tell me what these lines were. "No," I said, "I know them by heart." In a subsequent address, unveiling a statue of Burns in the park at Montrose, I repeated the lines I supposed he referred to, and he approved them. He and I, strange to say, had received the freedom of Montrose together years before, so we are fellow freemen. At last I induced Morley to visit us in America, and he made a tour through a great part of our country in 1904. We tried to have him meet distinguished men like himself. One day Senator Elihu Root called at my request, and Morley had a long interview with him. After the Senator left, Morley remarked to me that he had enjoyed his companion greatly, as being the most satisfactory American statesman he had yet met. He was not mistaken. For sound judgment and wide knowledge of our public affairs, Elihu Root has no superior. Morley left us to pay a visit to President Roosevelt at the White House, and spent several fruitful days in company with that extraordinary man. Later, Morley's remark was, "Well, I've seen 2 wonders in America, Roosevelt and Niagara." That was clever and true to life, a great pair of roaring, tumbling, dashing and splashing wonders, knowing no rest, but both doing their appointed work, such as it is. Morley was the best person to have the Acton Library, and my gift of it to him came about in this way. When Mr. Gladstone told me the position Lord Acton was in, I agreed, at his suggestion, to buy Acton's library and allow it to remain for his use during life. Unfortunately, he did not live long to enjoy it, only a few years, and then I had the library upon my hands. I decided that Morley could make the best use of it for himself and would certainly leave it eventually to the proper institution. I began to tell him that I owned it, when he interrupted me, saying, "Well, I must tell you, I have known this from the day you bought it. Mr. Gladstone couldn't keep the secret, being so overjoyed that Lord Acton had it secure for life." Here were he and I in close intimacy, and yet never had one mentioned the situation to the other. But it was a surprise to me that Morley was not surprised. This incident proved the closeness of the bond between Gladstone and Morley, the only man he could not resist sharing his happiness with regarding earthly affairs. Yet on theological subjects they were far apart, where Acton and Gladstone were akin. The year after I gave the fund for the Scottish universities, Morley went to Balmoral as minister in attendance upon His Majesty, and wired that he must see me before we sailed. We met, and he informed me His Majesty was deeply impressed with the gift to the universities and the others I had made to my native land, and wished him to ascertain whether there was anything in his power to bestow which I would appreciate. I asked, "What did you say?" Morley replied, "I do not think so." I said, "You are quite right, except that if His Majesty would write me a note expressing his satisfaction with what I have done, as he has to you, this would be deeply appreciated and handed down to my descendants as something they would all be proud of." This was done. The King's autograph note I have already transcribed elsewhere in these pages. That Skibo had proved the best of all health resorts for Morley is indeed fortunate, for he comes to us several times each summer and is one of the family, Lady Morley accompanying him. He is as fond of the yacht as I am myself, and fortunately again it is the best medicine for both of us. Morley is, and must always remain, honest John. No prevarication with him, no nonsense, firm as a rock upon all questions and in all emergencies, yet always looking around, fore and aft, right and left, with a big heart not often revealed in all its tenderness, but at rare intervals and upon fit occasion leaving no doubt of its presence and power. And after that, silence. Chamberlain and Morley were fast friends as advanced radicals, and I often met and conferred with them when in Britain. When the Home Rule issue was raised, much interest was aroused in Britain over our American federal system. I was appealed to freely and delivered public addresses in several cities, explaining and extolling our Union, many in one, the freest government of the parts producing the strongest government of the whole. I sent Mr. Chamberlain Miss Anna L. Dawes's How We Are Governed at his request for information, and had conversations with Morley, Gladstone, and many others upon the subject. I had to write Mr. Morley that I did not approve of the first Home Rule Bill for reasons which I gave. When I met Mr. Gladstone, he expressed his regret at this, and a full talk ensued. I objected to the exclusion of the Irish members from Parliament as being a practical separation. I said we should never have allowed the Southern States to cease sending representatives to Washington. "What would you have done if they refused?" he asked. "Employed all the resources of civilization. First, stopped the mails," I replied. He paused and repeated, "Stop the mails." He felt the paralysis this involved and was silent, and changed the subject. In answer to questions as to what I should do, I always pointed out that America had many legislatures, but only one Congress. Britain should follow her example. One Parliament and local legislatures, not parliaments, for Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These should be made states like New York and Virginia. But as Britain has no Supreme Court, as we have, to decide upon laws passed, not only by state legislatures, but by Congress, the judicial being the final authority, and not the political, Britain should have Parliament as the one national final authority over Irish measures. Therefore, the acts of the local legislature of Ireland should lie for 3 months' continuous session upon the table of the House of Commons, subject to adverse action of the House, but becoming operative unless disapproved. The provision would be a dead letter unless improper legislation were enacted. But if there were improper legislation, then it would be salutary. The clause, I said, was needed to assure timid people that no secession could arise. Urging this view upon Mr. Morley afterwards, he told me this had been proposed to Parnell but rejected. Mr. Gladstone might then have said, "Very well, this provision is not needed for myself and others who think with me, but it is needed to enable us to carry Britain with us. I am now unable to take up the question. The responsibility is yours." One morning at Hawarden, Mrs. Gladstone said, "William tells me he has such extraordinary conversations with you." These he had, no doubt. He had not often, if ever, heard the breezy talk of a genuine Republican, and did not understand my inability to conceive of different hereditary ranks. It seemed strange to me that men should deliberately abandon the name given them by their parents, and that name the parents' name. Especially amusing were the new titles which required the old hereditary nobles much effort to refrain from smiling at as they greeted the newly made peer who had perhaps bought his title for £10,000, more or less, given to the party fund. Mr. Blaine was with us in London, and I told Mr. Gladstone he had expressed to me his wonder and pain at seeing him in his old age, hat in hand, cold day as it was, at a garden party doing homage to titled nobodies. Union of Church and State was touched upon, and also my "look ahead," which foretells the reunion of our race owing to the inability of the British Islands to expand. I had held that the disestablishment of the English Church was inevitable, because, among other reasons, it was an anomaly. No other part of the race had it. All religions were fostered, none favored, in every other English-speaking state. Mr. Gladstone asked, "How long do you give our established church to live?" My reply was I could not fix a date. He had had more experience than I in disestablishing churches. He nodded and smiled. When I had enlarged upon a certain relative decrease of populations in Britain that must come as compared with other countries of larger area, he asked, "What future do you forecast for her?" I referred to Greece among ancient nations and said that it was, perhaps, not accident that Chaucer, Shakespeare, Spencer, Milton, Burns, Scott, Stevenson, Bacon, Cromwell, Wallace, Bruce, Hume, Watt, Spencer, Darwin, and other celebrities had arisen here. Genius did not depend upon material resources. Long after Britain could not figure prominently as an industrial nation, not by her decline, but through the greater growth of others, she might, in my opinion, become the modern Greece and achieve among nations moral ascendancy. He caught at the words, repeating them musingly. Moral ascendancy. Moral ascendancy. I like that. I like that. I had never before so thoroughly enjoyed a conference with a man. I visited him again at Hawarden, but my last visit to him was at Lord Randall's at Cannes, the winter of 1897, when he was suffering keenly. He had still the old charm and was especially attentive to my sister-in-law, Lucy, who saw him then for the first time and was deeply impressed. As we drove off, she murmured, "A sick eagle, a sick eagle." Nothing could better describe this wan and worn leader of men as he appeared to me that day. He was not only a great, but a truly good man, stirred by the purest impulses, a high, imperious soul always looking upward. He had, indeed, earned the title "Foremost Citizen of the World." In Britain, in 1881, I had entered into business relations with Samuel Storey, M.P., a very able man, a stern radical, and a genuine Republican. We purchased several British newspapers and began a campaign of political progress upon radical lines. Passmore Edwards and some others joined us, but the result was not encouraging. Harmony did not prevail among my British friends, and finally I decided to withdraw, which I was fortunately able to do without loss. My third literary venture, Triumphant Democracy, had its origin in realizing how little the best informed foreigner, or even Briton, knew of America, and how distorted that little was. It was prodigious what these eminent Englishmen did not then know about the Republic. My first talk with Mr. Gladstone in 1882 can never be forgotten. When I had occasion to say that the majority of the English-speaking race was now Republican and it was a minority of monarchists who were upon the defensive, he said, "Why, how is that?" "Well, Mr. Gladstone," I said, "the Republic holds sway over a larger number of English-speaking people than the population of Great Britain and all her colonies, even if the English-speaking colonies were numbered twice over." "Ah, how is that? What is your population?" 66 millions, and yours is not much more than half." "Ah, yes, surprising." With regard to the wealth of the nations, it was equally surprising for him to learn that the census of 1880 proved the 100-year-old Republic could purchase Great Britain and Ireland and all their realized capital and investments and then pay off Britain's debt, and yet not exhaust her fortune. But the most startling statement of all was that which I was able to make when the question of free trade was touched upon. I pointed out that America was now the greatest manufacturing nation in the world. At a later date, I remember Lord Chancellor Haldane fell into the same error, calling Britain the greatest manufacturing country in the world, and thanked me for putting him right. I quoted Mulhall's figures. British manufactures in 1880, 816 millions sterling. American manufactures 1,126 millions sterling. His one word was, "Incredible." Other startling statements followed, and he asked, "Why does not some writer take up this subject and present the facts in a simple and direct form to the world?" I was then, as a matter of fact, gathering material for Triumphant Democracy, in which I intended to perform the very service which he indicated, as I informed him. Round the World and The American Four in Hand gave me not the slightest effort, but the preparation of Triumphant Democracy, which I began in 1882, was altogether another matter. It required steady, laborious work, Figures had to be examined and arranged, but as I went forward the study became fascinating. For some months I seemed to have my head filled with statistics. The hours passed away unheeded. It was evening when I supposed it was midday. The second serious illness of my life dates from the strain brought upon me by this work, for I had to attend to business as well. I shall think twice before I trust myself again with anything so fascinating as figures. End of chapter 24. Recording by William Tomcho. Of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 25. Herbert Spencer and his disciple. Herbert Spencer, with his friend Mr. Lott and myself, were fellow travelers on the Servia from Liverpool to New York in 1882. I bore a note of introduction to him from Mr. Morley, but I had met the philosopher in London before that. I was one of his disciples. As an older traveler, I took Mr. Lott and him in charge. We sat at the same table during the voyage. One day the conversation fell upon the impression made upon us by great men at first meeting. Did they or did they not prove to be as we had imagined them? Each gave his experience. Mine was that nothing could be more different than the being imagined, and that being beheld in the flesh. "Oh," said Mr. Spencer, "in my case, for instance, was this so?" "Yes," I replied, "you more than any. I had imagined my teacher, the great calm philosopher brooding, Buddha-like, over all things, unmoved. Never did I dream of seeing him excited over the question of Cheshire or Cheddar cheese." The day before, he had peevishly pushed away the former when presented by the steward, exclaiming, "Cheddar, Cheddar, not Cheshire. I said Cheddar." There was a roar in which none joined more heartily than the sage himself. He refers to this incident of the voyage in his autobiography. Spencer liked stories and was a good laugher. American stories seemed to please him more than others, and of those I was able to tell him not a few, which were usually followed by explosive laughter. He was anxious to learn about our Western territories, which were then attracting attention in Europe, and a story I told him about Texas struck him as amusing. When a returning disappointed emigrant from that state was asked about the then barren country, he said, "Stranger, all that I have to say about Texas is that if I owned Texas, and hell, I would sell Texas." What a change from those early days! Texas has now over 4 millions of population, and is said to have the soil to produce more cotton than the whole world did in 1882. The walk up to the house, when I had the philosopher out at Pittsburgh, reminded me of another American story of the visitor who started to come up the garden walk. When he opened the gate, a big dog from the house rushed down upon him. He retreated and closed the garden gate just in time, the host calling out, "He won't touch you. You know, barking dogs never bite." "Yes," exclaimed the visitor tremblingly, "I know that, and you know it, but does the dog know it?" One day my eldest nephew was seen to open the door quietly and peep in where we were seated. His mother afterwards asked him why he had done so, and the boy of 11 replied, "Mamma, I wanted to see the man who wrote in a book that there was no use studying grammar." Spencer was greatly pleased when he heard the story and often referred to it. He had faith in that nephew. Speaking to him one day about his having signed a remonstrance against a tunnel between Calais and Dover as having surprised me, he explained that for himself he was as anxious to have the tunnel as any one, and that he did not believe in any of the objections raised against it, but signed the remonstrance because he knew his countrymen were such fools that the military and naval element in Britain could stampede the masses, frighten them, and stimulate militarism. An increased army and navy would then be demanded. He referred to a scare which had once arisen and involved the outlay of many millions in fortifications, which had proved useless. One day we were sitting in our rooms in the Grand Hotel looking out over Trafalgar Square. The Life Guards passed, and the following took place. "Mr. Spencer, I never see men dressed up like Merry Andrews without being saddened and indignant that in the 19th century the most civilized race, as we consider ourselves, still finds men willing to adopt as a profession, until lately the only profession for gentlemen, the study of the surest means of killing other men." Mr. Spencer said, "I feel just so myself, but I will tell you how I curb my indignation. Whenever I feel it rising, I am calmed by this story of Emerson's. He had been hooted and hustled from the platform in Faneuil Hall for daring to speak against slavery. He describes himself walking home in violent anger, until opening his garden gate and looking up through the branches of the tall elms that grew between the gate and his modest home, he saw the stars shining through. They said to him, 'What, so hot, my little sir?' I laughed and he laughed, and I thanked him for that story. Not seldom I have to repeat to myself, 'What, so hot, my little sir?' and it suffices." Mr. Spencer's visit to America had its climax in the banquet given for him at Delmonico's. I drove him to it, and saw the great man there in a funk. He could think of nothing but the address he was to deliver. I believe he had rarely before spoken in public. His great fear was that he should be unable to say anything that would be of advantage to the American people, who had been the first to appreciate his works. He may have attended many banquets, but never one comprised of more distinguished people than this one. It was a remarkable gathering. The tributes paid Spencer by the ablest men were unique. The climax was reached when Henry Ward Beecher, concluding his address, turned round and addressed Mr. Spencer in these words: "To my father and my mother I owe my physical being. To you, sir, I owe my intellectual being. At a critical moment you provided the safe paths through the bogs and morasses. You were my teacher." These words were spoken in slow, solemn tones. I do not remember ever having noticed more depth of feeling. Evidently they came from a grateful debtor. Mr. Spencer was touched by the words. They gave rise to considerable remark, and shortly afterwards Mr. Beecher preached a course of sermons, giving his views upon evolution. The conclusion of the series was anxiously looked for, because his acknowledgment of debt to Spencer as his teacher had created alarm in church circles. In the concluding article, as in his speech, if I remember rightly, Mr. Beecher said that although he believed in evolution, Darwinism, up to a certain point, yet when man had reached his highest human level, his Creator then invested him, and man alone of all living things, with the Holy Spirit, thereby bringing him into the circle of the godlike. Thus he answered his critics. Mr. Spencer took intense interest in mechanical devices. When he visited our works with me, the new appliances impressed him, and in after years he sometimes referred to these, and said his estimate of American invention and push had been fully realized. He was naturally pleased with the deference and attention paid him in America. I seldom if ever visited England without going to see him, even after he had removed to Brighton, that he might live looking out upon the sea, which appealed to and soothed him. I never met a man who seemed to weigh so carefully every action, every word, even the pettiest, and so completely to find guidance through his own conscience. He was no scoffer in religious matters. In the domain of theology, however, he had little regard for decorum. It was to him a very faulty system hindering true growth, and the idea of rewards and punishments struck him as an appeal to very low natures indeed. Still, he never went to such lengths as Tennyson did upon an occasion when some of the old ideas were under discussion. Knowles told me that Tennyson lost control of himself. Knowles said he was greatly disappointed with the son's life of the poet as giving no true picture of his father in his revolt against stern theology. Spencer was always the calm philosopher. I believe that from childhood to old age, when the race was run, he never was guilty of an immoral act, or did an injustice to any human being. He was certainly one of the most conscientious men in all his doings that ever was born. Few men have wished to know another man more strongly than I to know Herbert Spencer. for seldom has one been more deeply indebted than I to him and to Darwin. Reaction against the theology of past days comes to many who have been surrounded in youth by church people entirely satisfied that the truth and faith indispensable to future happiness were derived only through strictest Calvinistic creeds. The thoughtful youth is naturally carried along and disposed to concur in this. He cannot but think, up to a certain period of development, that what is believed by the best and the highest educated around him, those to whom he looks for example and instruction, must be true. He resists doubt as inspired by the evil one seeking his soul, and sure to get it, unless faith comes to the rescue. Unfortunately, he soon finds that faith is not exactly at his beck and call. Original sin, he thinks, must be at the root of this inability to see as he wishes to see, to believe as he wishes to believe. It seems clear to him that already he is little better than one of the lost. Of the elect he surely cannot be, for these must be ministers, elders, and strictly orthodox men. The young man is soon in chronic rebellion, trying to assume godliness with the others, acquiescing outwardly in the creed and all its teachings, and yet at heart totally unable to reconcile his outward accordance with his inward doubt. If there be intellect and virtue in the man, but one result is possible. That is, Carlyle's position after his terrible struggle, when after weeks of torment he came forth, "If it be incredible, in God's name, then let it be discredited." With that, the load of doubt and fear fell from him forever. When I, along with 3 or 4 of my boon companions, was in this stage of doubt about theology, including the supernatural element, and indeed the whole scheme of salvation through vicarious atonement, and all the fabric built upon it, I came fortunately upon Darwin's and Spencer's works, the Data of Ethics, First Principles, Social Statics, the Descent of Man. Reaching the pages which explain how man has absorbed such mental foods as were favorable to him, retaining what was salutary, rejecting what was deleterious, I remember that light came as in a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. "All is well since all grows better" became my motto, my true source of comfort. Man was not created with an instinct for his own degradation, but from the lower he had risen to the higher forms. Nor is there any conceivable end to his march to perfection. His face is turned to the light. He stands in the sun and looks upward. Humanity is an organism, inherently rejecting all that is deleterious, that is, wrong, and absorbing after trial what is beneficial, that is, right. If so disposed, the architect of the universe, we must assume, might have made the world and man perfect, free from evil and from pain, as angels in heaven are thought to be. But although this was not done, man has been given the power of advancement rather than of retrogression. The Old and New Testaments remain, like other sacred writings of other lands, of value as records of the past and for such good lessons as they inculcate. Like the ancient writers of the Bible, our thoughts should rest upon this life and our duties here. To perform the duties of this world well, troubling not about another, is a prime wisdom, says Confucius, great sage and teacher. The next world and its duties we shall consider when we are placed in it. I am as a speck of dust in the sun, and not even so much, in this solemn, mysterious, unknowable universe. I shrink back. One truth I see, Franklin was right. The highest worship of God is service to man. All this, however, does not prevent everlasting hope of immortality. It would be no greater miracle to be born to a future life than to have been born to live in this present life. The one has been created, why not the other? Therefore, there is reason to hope for immortality. Let us hope. End of chapter 25. Recording by William Tomcho. Of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 26. Blaine and Harrison. While one is known by the company he keeps, it is equally true that one is known by the stories he tells. Mr. Blaine was one of the best story-tellers I ever met. He was a bright, sunny nature with a witty, pointed story for every occasion. Mr. Blaine's address at Yorktown (I had accompanied him there) was greatly admired. It directed special attention to the cordial friendship which had grown up between the two branches of the English-speaking race, and ended with the hope that the prevailing peace and good will between the two nations would exist for many centuries to come. When he read this to me, I remember that the word "many" jarred, and I said, "Mr. Secretary, might I suggest a change of one word? I don't like 'many.' Why not 'all the centuries to come'?" "Good! That is perfect." And so it was given in the address, "For all the centuries to come." We had a beautiful night returning from Yorktown, and sitting in the stern of the ship in the moonlight, the military band playing forward, we spoke of the effect of music. Mr. Blaine said that his favorite just then was the Sweet By and By, which he had heard played last by the same band at President Garfield's funeral, and he thought upon that occasion he was more deeply moved by sweet sounds than he had ever been in his life. He requested that it should be the last piece played that night. Both he and Gladstone were fond of simple music. They could enjoy Beethoven and the classic masters, but Wagner was as yet a sealed book to them. In answer to my inquiry as to the most successful speech he ever heard in Congress, he replied it was that of the German, ex-Governor Ritter of Pennsylvania. The first bill appropriating money for inland fresh waters was under consideration. The House was divided. Strict constructionists held this to be unconstitutional. Only harbors upon the salt sea were under the Federal government. The contest was keen and the result doubtful, when, to the astonishment of the House, Governor Ritter slowly arose for the first time. Silence at once reigned. What was the old German ex-governor going to say, he who had never said anything at all? Only this: "Mr. Speaker, I don't know much particulars about de Constitution, but I know dis: I wouldn't gif a damned cent for a Constitution dat didn't wash in fresh water as well as in salt." The House burst into an uproar of uncontrollable laughter, and the bill passed. So came about this new departure and one of the most beneficent ways of spending government money, and of employing Army and Navy engineers. Little of the money spent by the government yields so great a return. So expands our flexible Constitution to meet the new wants of an expanding population. Let who will make the Constitution if we of today are permitted to interpret it. Mr. Blaine's best story, if one can be selected from so many that were excellent, I think was the following. In the days of slavery and the Underground Railroads, there lived on the banks of the Ohio River near Gallipolis a noted Democrat named Judge French, who said to some anti-slavery friends that he should like them to bring to his office the first runaway negro that crossed the river, bound northward by the Underground. He couldn't understand why they wished to run away. This was done, and the following conversation took place. Judge: "So you have run away from Kentucky. Bad master, I suppose?" Slave: "Oh no, Judge, very good kind massa." Judge: "He worked you too hard?" Slave: "No, saw, never overworked myself all my life." Judge (hesitatingly): "He did not give you enough to eat." Slave: "Not enough to eat down in Kaintuck? Oh, Lor', plenty to eat." Judge: "He did not clothe you well." Slave: "Good enough clothes for me, Judge." Judge: "You hadn't a comfortable home?" Slave: "Oh, Lor', makes me cry to think of my pretty little cabin down dar in old Kaintuck." Judge (after a pause): "You had a good, kind master. You were not overworked. Plenty to eat, good clothes, fine home. I don't see why the devil you wish to run away." Slave: "Well, Judge, I left de situation down dar open. You can go right down and get it." The Judge had seen a great light. Freedom has 1,000 charms to show. that slaves, howe'er contented, never know. That the colored people in such numbers risked all for liberty is the best possible proof that they will steadily approach and finally reach the full stature of citizenship in the Republic. I never saw Mr. Blaine so happy as while with us at Cluny. He was a boy again, and we were a rollicking party together. He had never fished with a fly. I took him out on Loch Laggan, and he began awkwardly, as all do, but he soon caught the swing. I shall never forget his first capture. "My friend, you have taught me a new pleasure in life. There are 100 fishing lochs in Maine, and I'll spend my holidays in future upon them, trout fishing." At Cluny there is no night in June, and we danced on the lawn in the bright twilight until late. Mrs. Blaine, Miss Dodge, Mr. Blaine, and other guests were trying to do the Scotch reel, and whooping like Highlanders. We were gay revelers during those 2 weeks. One night afterwards, at a dinner in our home in New York, chiefly made up of our Cluny visitors, Mr. Blaine told the company that he had discovered at Cluny what a real holiday was. It is when the merest trifles become the most serious events of life. President Harrison's nomination for the presidency in 1888 came to Mr. Blaine while on a coaching trip with us. Mr. and Mrs. Blaine, Miss Margaret Blaine, Senator and Mrs. Hale, Miss Dodge, and Walter Damrosch were on the coach with us from London to Cluny Castle. In approaching Linlithgow from Edinburgh, we found the provost and magistrates in their gorgeous robes at the hotel to receive us. I was with them when Mr. Blaine came into the room with a cablegram in his hand, which he showed to me, asking what it meant. It read, "Use cipher." It was from Senator Elkins at the Chicago Convention. Mr. Blaine had cabled the previous day, declining to accept the nomination for the presidency unless Secretary Sherman of Ohio agreed, and Senator Elkins no doubt wished to be certain that he was in correspondence with Mr. Blaine and not with some interloper. I said to Mr. Blaine that the Senator had called to see me before sailing, and suggested we should have cipher words for the prominent candidates. I gave him a few and kept a copy upon a slip, which I put in my pocketbook. I looked and fortunately found it. Blaine was Victor, Harrison Trump, Phelps of New Jersey Star, and so on. I wired Trump and Star. This was in the evening. We retired for the night, and next day the whole party was paraded by the city authorities in their robes up the main street to the palace grounds, which were finely decorated with flags. Speeches of welcome were made and replied to. Mr. Blaine was called upon by the people and responded in a short address. Just then a cablegram was handed to him, "Harrison and Morton nominated." Phelps had declined. So passed forever Mr. Blaine's chance of holding the highest of all political offices. He elected of the majority of the English-speaking race. But he was once fairly elected to the presidency and done out of New York State, as was at last clearly proven, the perpetrators having been punished for an attempted repetition of the same fraud at a subsequent election. Mr. Blaine, as Secretary of State in Harrison's cabinet, was a decided success and the Pan American Congress his most brilliant triumph. My only political appointment came at this time and was that of a United States delegate to the Congress. It gave me a most interesting view of the South American republics and their various problems. We sat down together, representatives of all the republics but Brazil. One morning the announcement was made that a new constitution had been ratified. Brazil had become a member of the sisterhood, making 17 republics in all, now 21. There was great applause and cordial greeting of the representatives of Brazil, thus suddenly elevated. I found the South American representatives rather suspicious of their big brother's intentions. A sensitive spirit of independence was manifest, which it became our duty to recognize. In this, I think, we succeeded, but it will behoove subsequent governments to scrupulously respect the national feeling of our Southern neighbors. It is not control, but friendly cooperation upon terms of perfect equality we should seek. I sat next to Manuel Quintana, who afterwards became President of Argentina. He took a deep interest in the proceedings, and one day became rather critical upon a trifling issue, which led to an excited colloquy between him and Chairman Blaine. I believe it had its origin in a false translation from one language to another. I rose, slipped behind the chairman on the platform, whispering to him as I passed that if an adjournment was moved I was certain the differences could be adjusted. He nodded assent. I returned to my seat and moved adjournment, and during the interval all was satisfactorily arranged. Passing the delegates, as we were about to leave the hall, an incident occurred which comes back to me as I write. A delegate threw one arm around me, and with the other hand patting me on the breast, exclaimed, "Mr. Carnegie, you have more here than here," pointing to his pocket. Our Southern brethren are so lovingly demonstrative. Warm climes and warm hearts. In 1891 President Harrison went with me from Washington to Pittsburgh, as I have already stated, to open the Carnegie Hall and Library, which I had presented to Allegheny City. We traveled over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad by daylight and enjoyed the trip, the President being especially pleased with the scenery. Reaching Pittsburgh at dark, the flaming coke ovens and dense pillars of smoke and fire amazed him. The well-known description of Pittsburgh seen from the hilltops as "hell with the lid off" seemed to him most appropriate. He was the first President who ever visited Pittsburgh. President Harrison, his grandfather, had, however, passed from steamboat to canal boat here on his way to Washington after election. The opening ceremony was largely attended owing to the presence of the President, and all passed off well. Next morning the President wished to see our steel works, and he was escorted there, receiving a cordial welcome from the workmen. I called up each successive manager of department as we passed and presented him. Finally, when Mr. Schwab was presented, the President turned to me and said, "How is this, Mr. Carnegie? You present only boys to me." "Yes, Mr. President, but do you notice what kind of boys they are?" "Yes, hustlers, every one of them," was his comment. He was right. No such young men could have been found for such work elsewhere in this world. They had been promoted to partnership without cost or risk. If the profits did not pay for their shares, no responsibility remained upon the young men. A giving thus to "partners" is very different from paying wages to employees in corporations. The President's visit, not to Pittsburgh, but to Allegheny over the river, had one beneficial result. Members of the City Council of Pittsburgh reminded me that I had first offered Pittsburgh money for a library and hall, which it declined, and that then Allegheny City had asked if I would give them to her, which I did. The President visiting Allegheny to open the library and hall there, and the ignoring of Pittsburgh, was too much. Her authorities came to me again the morning after the Allegheny City opening, asking if I would renew my offer to Pittsburgh. If so, the city would accept and agree to expend upon maintenance a larger percentage than I had previously asked. I was only too happy to do this, and instead of $250,000 I offered $1,000,000. My ideas had expanded. Thus was started the Carnegie Institute. Pittsburgh's leading citizens are spending freely upon artistic things. This center of manufacturing has had its permanent orchestra for some years, Boston and Chicago being the only other cities in America that can boast of one. A naturalist club and a school of painting have sprung up. The success of library, art gallery, museum, and music hall, a noble quartet in an immense building, is one of the chief satisfactions of my life. This is my monument, because here I lived my early life and made my start, and I am to day in heart a devoted son of dear old smoky Pittsburgh. Herbert Spencer heard, while with us in Pittsburgh, some account of the rejection of my first offer of a library to Pittsburgh. When the second offer was made, he wrote me that he did not understand how I could renew it. He never could have done so. They did not deserve it. I wrote the philosopher that if I had made the first offer to Pittsburgh that I might receive her thanks and gratitude, I deserved the personal arrows shot at me and the accusations made that only my own glorification and a monument to my memory were sought. I should then probably have felt as he did. But, as it was the good of the people of Pittsburgh I had in view, among whom I had made my fortune, the unfounded suspicions of some natures only quickened my desire to work their good by planting in their midst a potent influence for higher things. This the Institute, thank the kind fates, has done. Pittsburgh has played her part nobly. End of chapter 26. Recording by William Tomcho. Seven of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 27. Washington Diplomacy. President Harrison had been a soldier and as president was a little disposed to fight. His attitude gave some of his friends concern. He was opposed to arbitrating the Bering Sea question when Lord Salisbury, at the dictation of Canada, had to repudiate the Blaine agreement for its settlement, and was disposed to proceed to extreme measures. But calmer counsels prevailed. He was determined also to uphold the force bill against the South. When the quarrel arose with Chile, there was a time when it seemed almost impossible to keep the President from taking action which would have resulted in war. He had great personal provocation because the Chilean authorities had been most indiscreet in their statements in regard to his action. I went to Washington to see whether I could not do something toward reconciling the belligerents, because, having been a member of the first Pan American Conference, I had become acquainted with the representatives from our southern sister republics and was on good terms with them. As luck would have it, I was just entering the Shoreham Hotel when I saw Senator Henderson of Missouri, who had been my fellow delegate to the conference. He stopped and greeted me, and, looking across the street, he said, "There's the President beckoning to you." I crossed the street. "Hello, Carnegie. When did you arrive?" "Just arrived, Mr. President. I was entering the hotel." "What are you here for?" "To have a talk with you." "Well, come along and talk as we walk." The President took my arm and we promenaded the streets of Washington in the dusk for more than an hour, during which time the discussion was lively. I told him that he had appointed me a delegate to the Pan American Conference, that he had assured the South American delegates when they parted that he had given a military review in their honor to show them, not that we had an army, but rather that we had none and needed none, that we were the big brother in the family of republics, and that all disputes, if any arose, would be settled by peaceful arbitration. I was therefore surprised and grieved to find that he was now apparently taking a different course, threatening to resort to war in a paltry dispute with Little Chile. "You're a New Yorker and think nothing but business and dollars. That is the way with New Yorkers. They care nothing for the dignity and honor of the Republic," said His Excellency. "Mr. President, I am one of the men in the United States who would profit most by war. It might throw millions into my pockets as the largest manufacturer of steel." "Well, that is probably true in your case. I had forgotten." "Mr. President, if I were going to fight, I would take someone of my size." "Well, would you let any nation insult and dishonor you because of its size?" "Mr. President, no man can dishonor me except myself. Honor wounds must be self-inflicted." "You see our sailors were attacked on shore and 2 of them killed, and you would stand that?" he asked. "Mr. President, I do not think the United States dishonored every time a row among drunken sailors takes place. Besides, these were not American sailors at all. They were foreigners, as you see by their names. I would be disposed to cashier the captain of that ship for allowing the sailors to go on shore when there was rioting in the town and the public peace had been already disturbed." The discussion continued until we had finally reached the door of the White House in the dark. The President told me he had an engagement to dine out that night, but invited me to dine with him the next evening, when, as he said, there would be only the family and we could talk. "I am greatly honored, and shall be with you tomorrow evening," I said. And so we parted. The next morning I went over to see Mr. Blaine, then Secretary of State. He rose from his seat and held out both hands. "Oh, why weren't you dining with us last night?" When the president told Mrs. Blaine that you were in town, she said, "Just think, Mr. Carnegie is in town and I had a vacant seat here he could have occupied." "Well, Mr. Blaine, I think it is rather fortunate that I have not seen you," I replied, and I then told him what had occurred with the president. "Yes," he said, "it really was fortunate. The president might have thought you and I were in collusion." Senator Elkins of West Virginia, a bosom friend of Mr. Blaine, and also a very good friend of the president, happened to come in, and he said he had seen the president, who told him that he had had a talk with me upon the Chilean affair last evening, and that I had come down hot upon the subject. "Well, Mr. President," said Senator Elkins, "it is not probable that Mr. Carnegie would speak as plainly to you as he would to me. He feels very keenly, but he would naturally be somewhat reserved in talking to you." The president replied, "I didn't see the slightest indication of reserve, I assure you." The matter was adjusted, thanks to the peace policy characteristic of Mr. Blaine. More than once he kept the United States out of foreign trouble, as I personally knew. The reputation that he had of being an aggressive American really enabled that great man to make concessions which, made by another, might not have been readily accepted by the people. I had a long and friendly talk with the president that evening at dinner, but he was not looking at all well. I ventured to say to him he needed a rest. By all means he should get away. He said he had intended going off on a revenue cutter for a few days, but Judge Bradley of the Supreme Court had died and he must find a worthy successor. I said there was one I could not recommend because we had fished together and were such intimate friends that we could not judge each other disinterestedly, but he might inquire about him. Mr. Shiraz, of Pittsburgh. He did so and appointed him. Mr. Shiraz received the strong support of the best elements everywhere. Neither my recommendation nor that of any one else would have weighed with President Harrison one particle in making the appointment if he had not found Mr. Shiraz the very man he wanted. In the Bering Sea dispute the president was incensed at Lord Salisbury's repudiation of the stipulations for settling the question which had been agreed to. The president had determined to reject the counter proposition to submit it to arbitration. Mr. Blaine was with the president in this and naturally indignant that his plan, which Salisbury had extolled through his ambassador, had been discarded. I found both of them in no compromising mood. The president was much the more excited of the two, however. Talking it over with Mr. Blaine alone, I explained to him that Salisbury was powerless. Against Canada's protest he could not force acceptance of the stipulations to which he had hastily agreed. There was another element. He had a dispute with Newfoundland on hand, which the latter was insisting must be settled to her advantage. No government in Britain could add Canadian dissatisfaction to that of Newfoundland. Salisbury had done the best he could. After a while Blaine was convinced of this and succeeded in bringing the president into line. The Bering Sea troubles brought about some rather amusing situations. One day Sir John Macdonald, Canadian Premier, and his party reached Washington and asked Mr. Blaine to arrange an interview with the president upon this subject. Mr. Blaine replied that he would see the president and inform Sir John the next morning. "Of course," said Mr. Blaine, telling me the story in Washington just after the incident occurred, "I knew very well that the president could not meet Sir John and his friends officially, and when they called I told them so. Sir John said that Canada was independent, as sovereign as the state of New York was in the Union. Mr. Blaine replied he was afraid that if he ever obtained an interview as Premier of Canada with the state authorities of New York, he would soon hear something on the subject from Washington, and so would the New York state authorities. It was because the president and Mr. Blaine were convinced that the British government at home could not fulfill the stipulations agreed upon that they accepted Salisbury's proposal for arbitration, believing he had done his best. That was a very sore disappointment to Mr. Blaine. He had suggested that Britain and America should each place two small vessels on Bering Sea with equal rights to board or arrest fishing vessels under either flag, in fact, a joint police force. To give Salisbury due credit, he cabled the British ambassador, Sir Julian Pauncefote, to congratulate Mr. Blaine upon his brilliant suggestion. It would have given equal rights to each, and under either or both flags for the first time in history. A just and brotherly compact. Sir Julian had shown this cable to Mr. Blaine. I mention this here to suggest that able and willing statesmen anxious to cooperate are sometimes unable to do so. Mr. Blaine was indeed a great statesman, a man of wide views, sound judgment, and always for peace. Upon war with Chile, upon the Force Bill, and the Bering Sea question he was calm, wise, and peace-pursuing. Especially was he favorable to drawing closer and closer to our own English-speaking race. For France he had gratitude unbounded for the part she had played in our Revolutionary War, but this did not cause him to lose his head. One night at dinner in London, Mr. Blaine was at close quarters for a moment. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty came up. A leading statesman present said that the impression they had was that Mr. Blaine had always been inimical to the mother country. Mr. Blaine disclaimed this, and justly so, as far as I knew his sentiments. His correspondence upon the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was instanced. Mr. Blaine replied: "When I became Secretary of State and had to take up that subject, I was surprised to find that your Secretary for Foreign Affairs was always informing us what Her Majesty expected, while our Secretary of State was telling you what our President ventured to hope. When I received a dispatch telling us what Her Majesty expected, I replied, telling you what our President expected." "Well, you admit you'd changed the character of the correspondence," was shot at him. Quick as a flash came the response: "Not more than conditions had changed. The United States had passed the stage of venturing to hope with any power that expects. I only followed your example, and should ever Her Majesty venture to hope, the President will always be found doing the same. I am afraid that as long as you expect, the United States will also expect in return." One night there was a dinner where Mr. Joseph Chamberlain and Sir Charles Tennant, president of the Scotland Steel Company, were guests. During the evening the former said that his friend Carnegie was a good fellow, and they all delighted to see him succeeding, but he didn't know why the United States should give him protection worth £1,000,000 sterling per year or more for condescending to manufacture steel rails. "Well," said Mr. Blaine, "we don't look at it in that light. I am interested in railroads, and we formerly used to pay you for steel rails $90 per ton for every ton we got, nothing less. Now, just before I sailed from home, our people made a large contract with our friend Carnegie at $30 per ton. I am somewhat under the impression that if Carnegie and others had not risked their capital in developing their manufacture on our side of the Atlantic, we would still be paying you $90 per ton today." Here Mr. Charles broke in: "You may be sure you would. $90 was our agreed upon price for you foreigners." Mr. Blaine smilingly remarked: "Mr. Chamberlain, I don't think you have made a very good case against our friend Carnegie." "No," he replied. "How could I, with Sir Charles giving me away like that?" And there was general laughter. Blaine was a rare raconteur, and his talk had this great merit: never did I hear him tell a story or speak a word unsuitable for any, even the most fastidious company to hear. He was as quick as a steel trap, a delightful companion, and he would have made an excellent and yet safe president. I found him truly conservative and strong for peace upon all international questions. End of chapter 27. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 28 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie. by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 28. Hay and McKinley. John Hay was our frequent guest in England and Scotland, and was on the eve of coming to us at Skibo in 1898 when called home by President McKinley to become Secretary of State. Few have made such a record in that office. He inspired men with absolute confidence in his sincerity, and his aspirations were always high. War he detested, and meant what he said when he pronounced it the most ferocious and yet the most futile folly of man. The Philippines annexation was a burning question when I met him and Henry White, Secretary of Legation and later Ambassador to France in London, on my way to New York. It gratified me to find our views were similar upon that proposed serious departure from our traditional policy of avoiding distant and disconnected possessions and keeping our empire within the continent, especially keeping it out of the vortex of militarism. Hay, White, and I clasped hands together in Hay's office in London and agreed upon this. Before that he had written me the following note: London, August 22, 1898. My dear Carnegie, I thank you for the Skibo grouse and also for your kind letter. It is a solemn and absorbing thing to hear so many kind and unmerited words as I have heard and read this last week. It seems to me another man they are talking about, while I am expected to do the work. I wish a little of the kindness could be saved till I leave office finally. I have read with keenest interest your article in the North American. I am not allowed to say in my present fix how much I agree with you. The only question on my mind is how far it is now possible for us to withdraw from the Philippines. I am rather thankful it is not given to me to solve that momentous question. It was a strange fate that placed upon him the very task he had congratulated himself was never to be his. He stood alone at first as friendly to China in the Boxer troubles and succeeded in securing for her fair terms of peace. His regard for Britain, as part of our own race, was deep, and here the President was thoroughly with him, and grateful beyond measure to Britain for standing against other European powers disposed to favor Spain in the Cuban War. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty concerning the Panama Canal seemed to many of us unsatisfactory. Senator Elkins told me my objections, given in the New York Tribune, reached him the day he was to speak upon it, and were useful. Visiting Washington soon after the article appeared, I went with Senator Hanna to the White House early in the morning and found the President much exercised over the Senate's amendment to the treaty. I had no doubt of Britain's prompt acquiescence in the Senate's requirements, and said so. Anything in reason she would give, since it was we who had to furnish the funds for the work from which she would be, next to ourselves, the greatest gainer. Senator Hanna asked if I had seen John, as he and President McKinley always called Mr. Hay. I said I had not. Then he asked me to go over and cheer him up, for he was disconsolate about the amendments. I did so. I pointed out to Mr. Hay that the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had been amended by the Senate, and scarcely anyone knew this now, and no one cared. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty would be executed as amended, and no one would care a fig whether it was in its original form or not. He doubted this, and thought Britain would be indisposed to recede. A short time after this, dining with him, he said I had proved a true prophet and all was well. Of course it was. Britain had practically told us she wished the canal built, and would act in any way desired. The canal is now as it should be, that is, all American, with no international complications possible. It was, perhaps, not worth building at that time, but it was better to spend 300 or 400 millions upon it than in building sea monsters of destruction to fight imaginary foes. One may be a loss, and there an end. The other might be a source of war, for oft the sight of means to do ill deeds make deeds ill done. Mr. Hay's bête noire was the Senate. Upon this, and this only, was he disregardful of the proprieties. When it presumed to alter one word, substituting treaty for agreement, which occurred in one place only in the proposed arbitration treaty of 1905, he became unduly excited. I believe this was owing in great degree to poor health, for it was clear by that time to intimate friends that his health was seriously impaired. The last time I saw him was at lunch at his house, when the arbitration treaty, as amended by the Senate, was under the consideration of President Roosevelt. The arbitrationists, headed by the ex-Secretary of State Foster, urged the President's acceptance of the amended treaty. We thought he was favorable to this, but from my subsequent talk with Secretary Hay, I saw that the President's agreeing would be keenly felt. I should not be surprised if Roosevelt's rejection of the treaty was resolved upon chiefly to soothe his dear friend John Hay in his illness. I am sure I felt that I could be brought to do, only with the greatest difficulty, anything that would annoy that noble soul. But upon this point Hay was obdurate. No surrender to the Senate. Leaving his house, I said to Mrs. Carnegie that I doubted if ever we should meet our friend again. We never did. The Carnegie Institution of Washington, of which Hay was the chairman and a trustee from the start, received his endorsement and close attention, and much were we indebted to him for wise counsel. As a statesman, he made his reputation in shorter time and with a surer touch than any other I know of, and it may be doubted if any public man ever had more deeply attached friends. One of his notes I have long kept. It would have been the most flattering of any to my literary vanity, but for my knowledge of his most lovable nature and undue warmth for his friends. The world is poor to me today as I write, since he has left it. The Spanish War was the result of a wave of passion started by the reports of the horrors of the Cuban Revolution. President McKinley tried hard to avoid it. When the Spanish minister left Washington, the French ambassador became Spain's agent, and peaceful negotiations were continued. Spain offered autonomy for Cuba. The President replied that he did not know exactly what autonomy meant. What he wished for Cuba was the rights that Canada possessed. He understood these. A cable was shown to the President by the French minister, stating that Spain granted this, and he, dear man, supposed all was settled. So it was, apparently. Speaker Reed usually came to see me Sunday mornings when in New York, and it was immediately after my return from Europe that year that he called and said he had never lost control of the House before. For one moment he thought of leaving the chair and going on the floor to address the House and try to quiet it. In vain it was explained that the President had received from Spain the guarantee of self-government for Cuba. Alas, it was too late, too late. "What is Spain doing over here, anyhow?" was the imperious inquiry of Congress. A sufficient number of Republicans had agreed to vote with the Democrats in Congress for war. A whirlwind of passion swept over the House, intensified, no doubt, by the unfortunate explosion of the warship Maine in Havana Harbor, supposed by some to be Spanish work. The supposition gave Spain far too much credit for skill and activity. War was declared, the Senate being shocked by Senator Proctor's statement of the concentration camps he had seen in Cuba. The country responded to the cry. "What is Spain doing over here, anyhow?" President McKinley and his peace policy were left high and dry, and nothing remained for him but to go with the country. The government then announced that war was not undertaken for territorial aggrandizement, and Cuba was promised independence, a promise faithfully kept. We should not fail to remember this, for it is the one cheering feature of the war. The possession of the Philippines left a stain. They were not only territorial acquisition, they were dragged from reluctant Spain, and $20 million paid for them. The Filipinos had been our allies in fighting Spain. The Cabinet, under the lead of the President, had agreed that only a coaling station in the Philippines should be asked for, and it is said such were the instructions given by cable at first to the peace commissioners at Paris. President McKinley then made a tour through the West and, of course, was cheered when he spoke of the flag and Dewey's victory. He returned impressed with the idea that withdrawal would be unpopular, and reversed his former policy. I was told by one of his cabinet that every member was opposed to the reversal. A senator told me Judge Day, one of the peace commissioners, wrote a remonstrance from Paris, which, if ever published, would rank next to Washington's farewell address. So fine was it. At this stage an important member of the cabinet, my friend Cornelius N. Bliss, called and asked me to visit Washington and see the President on the subject. He said, "You have influence with him. None of us have been able to move him since he returned from the West." I went to Washington and had an interview with him. But he was obdurate. Withdrawal would create a revolution at home, he said. Finally, by persuading his secretaries that he had to bend to the blast, and always holding that it would be only a temporary occupation and that a way out would be found, the cabinet yielded. He sent for President Sherman, of Cornell University, who had opposed annexation, and made him chairman of the committee, to visit the Filipinos; and later for Judge Taft, who had been prominent against such a violation of American policy, to go as governor. When the judge stated that it seemed strange to send for one who had publicly denounced annexation, the President said that was the very reason why he wished him for the place. This was all very well, but to refrain from annexing and to relinquish territory once purchased are different propositions. This was soon seen. Mr. Bryan had it in his power at one time to defeat in the Senate this feature of the treaty of peace with Spain. I went to Washington to try to effect this, and remained there until the vote was taken. I was told that when Mr. Bryan was in Washington he had advised his friends that it would be good party policy to allow the treaty to pass. This would discredit the Republican Party before the people; that paying $20 millions for a revolution would defeat any party. There were 7 staunch Bryan men anxious to vote against Philippine annexation. Mr. Bryan had called to see me in New York upon the subject, because my opposition to the purchase had been so pronounced, and I now wired him at Omaha explaining the situation and begging him to wire me that his friends would use their own judgment. His reply was what I have stated: better have the Republicans pass it and let it then go before the people. I thought it unworthy of him to subordinate such an issue, fraught with deplorable consequences, to mere party politics. It required the casting vote of the Speaker to carry the measure. One word from Mr. Bryan would have saved the country from the disaster. I could not be cordial to him for years afterwards. He had seemed to me a man who was willing to sacrifice his country and his personal convictions for party advantage. When I called upon President McKinley immediately after the vote, I condoled with him upon being dependent for support upon his leading opponent. I explained just how his victory had been won, and suggested that he should send his grateful acknowledgments to Mr. Bryan. A colonial possession thousands of miles away was a novel problem to President McKinley, and indeed to all American statesmen. Nothing did they know of the troubles and dangers it would involve. Here the Republic made its first grievous international mistake, a mistake which dragged it into the vortex of international militarism and a great navy. What a change has come over statesmen since! At supper with President Roosevelt at the White House a few weeks ago (1907), he said: "If you wish to see the 2 men in the United States who are the most anxious to get out of the Philippines, here they are," pointing to Secretary Taft and himself. "Then why don't you?" I responded. "The American people would be glad indeed." But both the President and Judge Taft believed our duty required us to prepare the islands for self-government first. This is the policy of "don't go into the water until you learn to swim." But the plunge has to be and will be taken some day. It was urged that if we did not occupy the Philippines, Germany would. It never occurred to the urgers that this would mean Britain agreeing that Germany should establish a naval base at Macao. A short sail from Britain's naval base in the East Britain would as soon permit her to establish a base at Kingston, Ireland, 80 miles from Liverpool. I was surprised to hear men like Judge Taft, although he was opposed at first to the annexation, give this reason when we were discussing the question after the fatal step had been taken. But we know little of foreign relations. We have hitherto been a consolidated country. It will be a sad day if we ever become anything otherwise. End of chapter 28. Recording by William Tomcho. 9 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 29. Meeting the German Emperor. My first rectorial address to the students of St. Andrew's University attracted the attention of the German Emperor, who sent word to me in New York by Herr Blaine that he had read every word of it. He also sent me by him a copy of his address upon his eldest son's consecration. Invitations to meet him followed, but it was not until June, 1907, that I could leave, owing to other engagements. Mrs. Carnegie and I went to Kiel. Mr. Tower, our American ambassador to Germany, and Mrs. Tower met us there and were very kind in their attentions. Through them we met many of the distinguished public men during our 3 days' stay there. The first morning Mr. Tower took me to register on the Emperor's yacht. I had no expectation of seeing the Emperor, but he happened to come on deck, and seeing Mr. Tower, he asked what had brought him on the yacht so early. Mr. Tower explained that he had brought me over to register, and that Mr. Carnegie was on board. He asked, "Why not present him now? I wish to see him." I was talking to the admirals who were assembling for a conference, and did not see Mr. Tower and the Emperor approaching from behind. A touch on my shoulder, and I turned around. Mr. Carnegie, the Emperor. It was a moment before I realized that the Emperor was before me. I raised both hands and exclaimed, "This has happened just as I could have wished, with no ceremony," and the man of destiny dropped from the clouds. Then I continued, "Your Majesty, I have traveled 2 nights to accept your generous invitation, and never did so before to meet a crowned head." Then the Emperor, smiling, and such a captivating smile, "Oh, yes, yes, I have read your books. You do not like kings." "No, your Majesty, I do not like kings, but I do like a man behind a king when I find him." "Ah, there is one king you like, I know, a Scottish king, Robert the Bruce. He was my hero in my youth. I was brought up on him." "Yes, your Majesty, so was I, and he lies buried in Dunfermline Abbey in my native town. When a boy, I used to walk often around the towering square monument on the Abbey, one word on each block in big stone letters, King Robert the Bruce, with all the fervor of a Catholic counting his heads. But Bruce was much more than a king, your Majesty. He was the leader of his people. And not the first. Wallace the man of the people comes first. Your Majesty, I now own King Malcolm's Tower in Dunfermline, he from whom you derive your precious heritage of Scottish blood. Perhaps you know the fine old ballad, Sir Patrick Spens. The king sits in Dunfermline Tower, drinking the bluid red wine. I should like to escort you some day to the tower of your Scottish ancestor, that you may do homage to his memory." He exclaimed, "That would be very fine. The Scotch are much quicker and cleverer than the Germans. The Germans are too slow. Your Majesty, where anything Scotch is concerned, I must decline to accept you as an impartial judge." He laughed and waved adieu, calling out, "You are to dine with me this evening," and excusing himself went to greet the arriving admirals. About 60 were present at the dinner, and we had a pleasant time. Indeed, His Majesty, opposite whom I sat, was good enough to raise his glass and invite me to drink with him. After he had done so with Mr. Tower, our ambassador, who sat at his right, he asked across the table, heard by those near, whether I had told Prince von Bülow, next whom I sat, that his, the Emperor's, hero, Bruce, rested in my native town of Dunfermline, and his ancestor's tower in Pittencrieff Glen was in my possession. "No," I replied, "with your Majesty I am led into such frivolities, but my intercourse with your Lord High Chancellor, I assure you, will always be of a serious import." We dined with Mrs. Goelet upon her yacht one evening, and His Majesty being present, I told him President Roosevelt had said recently to me that he wished custom permitted him to leave the country so he could run over and see him, the Emperor. He thought a substantial talk would result in something good being accomplished. I believed that also. The Emperor agreed and said he wished greatly to see him and hoped he would some day come to Germany. I suggested that he, the Emperor, was free from constitutional barriers and could sail over and see the President. "Ah, but my country needs me here. How can I leave?" I replied. Before leaving home one year, when I went to our mills to bid the officials good bye and expressed regret at leaving them all hard at work, sweltering in the hot sun, but that I found I had now every year to rest, and yet no matter how tired I might be, 1/2 hour on the bow of the steamer, cutting the Atlantic waves, gave me perfect relief. My clever manager, Captain Jones, retorted, "And, oh Lord, think of the relief we all get." "It might be the same with your people, Your Majesty." He laughed heartily over and over again. It opened a new train of thought. He repeated his desire to meet President Roosevelt, and I said, "Well, Your Majesty, when you two do get together, I think I shall have to be with you. You and he, I fear, might get into mischief." He laughed and said, "Oh, I see. You wish to drive us together. Well, I agree if you make Roosevelt first horse. I shall follow." "Ah, no, Your Majesty. I know horseflesh better than to attempt to drive two such gay colts tandem. You never get proper purchase on the first horse. I must yoke you both in the shafts, neck and neck, so I can hold you in." I never met a man who enjoyed stories more keenly than the Emperor. He is fine company, and I believe an earnest man, anxious for the peace and progress of the world. Suffice it to say he insists that he is, and always has been, for peace. 1907. He cherishes the fact that he has reigned for 24 years and has never shed human blood. He considers that the German navy is too small to affect the British and was never intended to be a rival. Nevertheless, it is in my opinion very unwise, because unnecessary, to enlarge it. Prince von Bülow holds these sentiments, and I believe the peace of the world has little to fear from Germany. Her interests are all favorable to peace, industrial development being her aim, and in this desirable field she is certainly making great strides. I sent the Emperor, by his ambassador, Baron von Sternberg, the book, The Roosevelt Policy, to which I had written an introduction that pleased the President, and I rejoice in having received from him a fine bronze of himself with a valued letter. He is not only an emperor, but something much higher, a man anxious to improve existing conditions, untiring in his efforts to promote temperance, prevent dueling, and, I believe, to secure international peace. I have for some time been haunted with the feeling that the Emperor was indeed a man of destiny. My interviews with him have strengthened that feeling. I have great hopes of him in the future doing something really great and good. He may yet have a part to play that will give him a place among the immortals. He has ruled Germany in peace for 27 years, but something beyond even this record is due from one who has the power to establish peace among civilized nations through positive action. Maintaining peace in his own land is not sufficient from one whose invitation to other leading civilized nations to combine and establish arbitration of all international disputes would be gladly responded to. Whether he is to pass into history as only the preserver of internal peace at home, or is to rise to his appointed mission as the apostle of peace among leading civilized nations, the future has still to reveal. The year before last, 1912, I stood before him in the Grand Palace in Berlin and presented the American address of congratulations upon his peaceful reign of 25 years, his hand unstained by human blood. As I approached to hand to him the casket containing the address, he recognized me and with outstretched arms exclaimed, "Carnegie, 25 years of peace, and we hope for many more." I could not help responding, "And in this noblest of all missions you are our chief ally." He had hitherto sat silent and motionless, taking the successive addresses from one officer and handing them to another to be placed upon the table. The chief subject under discussion had been world peace, which he could have, and in my opinion would have secured, had he not been surrounded by the military caste which inevitably gathers about one born to the throne. a caste which usually becomes as permanent as the potentate himself, and which has so far in Germany proved its power of control whenever the war issue has been presented. Until militarism is subordinated, there can be no world peace. As I read this today, 1914, what a change! The world convulsed by war as never before. Men slaying each other like wild beasts. I dare not relinquish all hope. In recent days I see another ruler coming forward upon the world stage, who may prove himself the immortal one. The man who vindicated his country's honor in the Panama Canal toll dispute is now president. He has the indomitable will of genius, and true hope which we are told, "Kings it makes gods, and meaner creatures kings." Nothing is impossible to genius. Watch President Wilson. He has Scotch blood in his veins. Here the manuscript ends abruptly. End of chapter 29. End of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Recording by William Tomcho.